Welcome back, RP Plus. Dr. James Hoffman here. Welcome to our semi-new location in my house. I feel like Mr. Rogers. This is great. You guys get to see all parts of my house. Welcome back. Today, we're going to start an entirely new lecture series on one of my favorite topics, which is recovery adaptive strategies. So we're going to have many videos in this series, all of which are going to tell you the foundation of things that you need to know about how to get the most out of your training from a recovery standpoint. Now, there are some advanced concepts in this video. If you have not seen some of the more basic videos, like the strength conditioning basics and exercise physiology basics, those might be good to tune into before you watch this one. If you are pretty familiar with terms like volume, intensity, and periodization, you're good to go. If not, maybe go back and watch those videos first, and you'll get more out of this video later on. If you're ready to go, let's get started. So a lot of people are really interested in this topic. It's kind of hot, new, sexy, and some people think that I know a lot about these things. They are wrong, but I know more than you, and I'm going to help guide you along your training journey to get the most out of your recovery as possible. So this first lecture, we're really just going to outline some basic terms and some basic ideas that will help set the tone for the rest of the discussion later on when we get into more applied things. So for now, we're just going to outline some of the basic things you need to know. For those of you who are watching the video, please follow along with the PowerPoint, which will be side by side. If you're just listening to the audio, please enjoy the melodious tones of my voice. So sexy. All right, let's get started. So, if you've ever looked into recovery strategies, just like anything in exercise and nutrition, you've probably noticed there's a lot of hullabaloo, rigmarole, balderdash, bullshit, whatever you want to call it. Lots of weird stuff out there. And it can be very difficult to differentiate which strategies are useful and which ones are maybe less useful or maybe more situationally useful. So the goal of this discussion is to outline some of the fundamentals about recovery and fatigue, and then over the course of several videos, we'll start to be able to differentiate which strategies are really, really good and worth your time, which ones are maybe less worth your time, and then which ones might actually be just totally garbage and just not worth your time at all. We can't quite get there yet. We have to lay down some foundational information. So let's get going. One thing I like to put out there is a quote from my previous dissertation advisor when I was doing my PhD at ETSU, Dr. Bill Sands. I love this quote. I always start this discussion with this quote, and it's actually in the recovery book if you guys have ever checked that out. Really, really good. And I'll just read it to you for those of you who are listening. It is important to note that recovery adaptive strategies and techniques are not sufficiently powerful to overcome stupid coaching, bad planning, or a lack of talent. And I think that's really, really powerful, right? Because I think a lot of people put a lot of stock into these fun, sexy recovery modalities, thinking that that's going to take them to the next level. When the reality is, they're not sufficiently powerful to do that. And if you're doing a shitty job with your training stuff, your nutrition stuff, you have a shit lifestyle, and you're just not that good, none of these things are going to make you that much better. Really, we have to have the whole package, right? You have to have good training, good lifestyle, and you have to be relatively good at your sporting activities that you're doing. These strategies will enhance all of that, but they won't make or break you as an athlete. And I really, really like that. Dr. Bill Sands, really, really great researcher. He's done tons and tons and tons of research on recovery, so he's a good name to search if you're looking up good articles on recovery. He actually was the developer of the Recovery Center for the United States Olympic Training Site. Pretty cool. So I like that quote. I think it really sets a good tone where none of the things that we're going to talk about are groundbreaking or revolutionary, but they are worth noting and are worth our time, so it's worth a discussion. Okay, so one of the first things that we run into when looking into this idea of how do I enhance recovery is a definitional problem, just like with many things, right? So some people will call recovery this, some people will call it that. There is an inconsistent use of terms. So if we look at kind of more traditional definitions like this one listed by Kelman, we usually see kind of a medical or biological systems approach to recovery, which is fine. So if you're listening, this one says, the compensation of deficit states of an organism according to the homeostatic principle, a reestablishment of the initial state. So a more layperson description of that might be just kind of a return to normal, a return to baseline. You encountered some type of stressor, whether it was environmental, cellular, or something crazy like fitness, and we see a decrease in some baseline characteristic, whether it's performance or some disruption in homeostasis. So generally, using a medical or biological model, recovery kind of implies just a return back to where we were before we encountered the stressor. which makes sense. Unfortunately, this model does not work well in the context of recovering from hard training and sport because there's a major limitation. Can you guess what it is? Let me put it to you this way. When you go and do 5 sets of 10 of squats or deadlifts in the gym, do you expect that the outcome is simply to get back to where you were? Probably not. What you want is to become bigger, faster, stronger, better looking naked than you were before. That's the whole point. So we want to actually get better. We want to get above our baseline fitness characteristic, and we want to super compensate. And that idea is called adaptation, right? So we actually want to make training adaptations from the training that we're doing, not just get back to where we were. So any kind of traditional model typically does not address that adaptive component and leaves it largely incomplete. So that's a problem that we kind of run into. So if we don't have a definition that at least addresses the adaptation component in some way, unfortunately leaves us with a largely incomplete definition of recovery. There's the first one. Probably more of those to come too. So we also have a problem where there's confusion about whether recovery implies recovery from injury or recovery from training. And what we need to consider is that those are two different things. And they may overlap substantially in some areas, but they also may differentiate substantially in other areas. So some people have taken the same strategies and techniques used for recovery from injury and have tried or assumed that they are the same for strategies to promote recovery from hard training or from sport. And unfortunately, what we have found is that they are not always the same, and they should be generally treated differently, although they do overlap at times. So in our discussion, we're talking about recovery from hard training and sport, not recovery from kind of a catastrophic injury management type things. That's more physical therapy, athletic training, both of which are great, just not the context of this discussion. And often they get confused. So again, we're not talking about recovery from injury, we're talking about recovery from hard training. So, how do we put it into useful terms? Well, we've worked on a definition for a long time that we think is pretty good and meets the criteria that we need to be successful in the context of training. If you're looking at the screen, you can see it here, but for those of you listening, the working definition that we like to use, and this is one that we have come up with, it's not going to be in a textbook anywhere, this is just the one that we like to use for our purposes. The return of physiological systems to baseline, which results in restoration of athletic performance to pre-disruption levels, or at least to levels sufficient for further overload training. I like that one a lot. Why? Because I helped make it. But what's important here? We've addressed a couple things that were not addressed in the previous definitions. First, we have our recovery component, our return to baseline component, which is great. We also see a performance characteristic, and we also have the overload ability characteristic in there. So the overload principle is one that we use a lot to drive hard training, and it's one of the key components of making fitness adaptations. So we have that component in there. But what else is interesting within this definition? It says, or at least to levels sufficient for further overload training. Does that imply that you need to be fully recovered in order to keep training? No. This is another junior mistake that a lot of people make in this idea of studying recovery. They assume that recovery implies kind of full preparedness, full athletic ability, which is not necessarily true. All we need to do is present an overload in the next session, whatever time scale that we're operating in, whether it's day to day, week to week, month to month, etc. So the only constriction there is that we can present an overload. And we know that overload has an acute component, but also a time component where it has to continue getting harder over time. So we really like putting those two things together, and that is a really good working definition of recovery here. So you don't have to be fully recovered. You don't have to be at 100% of capacity. All you need is to be at a level sufficient to provide another overload within the time scale that we're talking about, whether it's, again, day to day, week to week, month to month, might be slightly different. So that's the definition that we're going to use going forward. Another definitional problem that we run into is this idea of fatigue. So we already mentioned that fatigue is kind of the counterpoint to recovery, right? Fatigue is what's inhibiting performance, and recovery is the point at which fatigue has been alleviated and we are back to our baseline characteristic. Unfortunately for us, if you go and look up fatigue, you will get inconsistent definitions across the board. I have listed a couple examples here on the slide that you can see. One we see as the inhibition of maximal performance that comes about as a result of stressors imposed on the individual. Not too bad, maybe not perfect. Another one that we see, this one's actually from Bompa, an acute impairment in the exercise performance, which ultimately can impair the ability to produce maximal force or control motor function. Also not too bad. The one that we probably like the most comes from Stone, and Sands, same guy, Bill Sands. And this idea of fatigue is broken down into kind of two components. The first one is acute fatigue, which is the fatigue that we experience during exercise or in the period kind of immediately afterwards, maybe lasting several hours, upwards of a day, right? So this is an acute impairment in performance as a result of some stress or training that we did earlier in the day, right? And what we would expect to see as performance is supposed to go down for a little while after that training session. And it makes sense. So if I said, okay, today you're going to do 5 sets of 10 in the squat. You say, great. You do it. Everything goes well. I give you a high five. And then I say, all right, now I'm going to take you out on the track and we're going to do a 200-meter sprint. You'd probably look at me like, bro, are you nuts? There's no way I can do that. Why not? Fatigue, right? Because you just did all those squats. There's no way you would expect to have a reasonable performance on those sprints because of all the fatigue you're carrying around from the session that you just did. So it makes sense. It's intuitive, right? So that one's good. We also see a chronic effect of fatigue. And what's really, really interesting is here we see chronic, diminished or poor performance as a result of the inability to recover from training load and the summation of physical and emotional stressors. Ooh, now we're getting somewhere really, really interesting. What I like about this definition, right, is it does not simply imply maximal performance, first of all. So we can see acute fatigue and chronic fatigue occurring both at the maximal and submaximal levels, meaning it's going to impair your best efforts, but it's also going to impair lower than your best efforts as well. We can also see there is a training component, and then it also lists an emotional component. And what we have found is that fatigue can come from both training factors, but also lifestyle factors, emotional and psychological stressors. Unfortunately for us, some of those emotional and psychological stressors can actually have physical manifestations when not kept in check. And this makes sense. If you've ever had a really bad, stressful week, something crazy happened, you know that it can start to take a toll on you physically. What we have also learned is that the fatigue that we summate from training and from lifestyle factors does not just kind of go away on its own. It tends to kind of linger around unless we take specific steps to ameliorate that fatigue over time. So acute fatigue is not a huge deal, but if you train 5 to 6 days a week, you are accumulating acute fatigue 5 to 6 days per week in addition to your lifestyle stressors. And now you have quite a bit of fatigue that's kind of accumulating, getting bigger throughout weeks and weeks and weeks, and it could start to become problematic if we don't take steps to get rid of it. Hence, we have this idea of fatigue management, and that's what we're mainly talking about here. So I like to use the Stone, and Sands definition of fatigue. You can use whichever one you like, but this is the one that I think is probably most useful for this discussion. So what types of things make us fatigue? Well, no-brainer, training, right? But what within training makes us tired? Well, first off, we know that there are things like volume and intensity, right? So for volume, basically we're referring to the total amount of work done for a training session. The more work you do, the more fatigue it generates, right? Within that work, whether it was running or lifting or sporting stuff, we know that the intensity plays a role as well. And generally, the higher the intensity, whether it's absolute, like movement speed or weight on the bar, or the relative intensity, which might be like reps in reserve or perceived effort, the higher the relative intensity, the more fatiguing per unit of work that work is, right? Or, per unit of time that work is. So we know that volume and intensity are big factors. We can also look at things like density and frequency, which essentially looks at how much training is being done per unit of time, like how much training is done per day or per week or per month. We can also look at other things like impacts, contacts, and direct disruptions. Some types of training are inherently more fatiguing than others. Plyometric exercise is a good example that comes to mind. Although it doesn't seem like that crazy while you're doing it, the amount of effort from the nervous system required to sustain that really gnarly rebound, that amortization phase from the muscle is very high. It also comes with impacts. Usually you have to hit the ground and rebound out of it very abruptly. and can cause a lot of both peripheral and central fatigue factors. We also know things like contacts. If you're in a contact sport like combat sports, wrestling, even things like soccer, rugby, football, where you're taking hits, also play a big role in fatigue. Why? Because those contacts actually directly damage the tissue itself, which will take time to heal and result in diminished performance, right? If you've ever been kicked or punched in the body or face or leg before, you know that you're not going to be walking around all that well later on that day, right? Why? Because you have directly disrupted that tissue and it's now not functioning at its full capacity. So we know there's a ton of training factors, and most of these are pretty intuitive, right? We also know that there are lifestyle factors that we should be aware of. One of them which being daily physical task, meaning how much physical activity do you do throughout the day? If you are an office worker and you're stuck on the computer all day in a chair, you probably have very low daily physical task simply because your job does not demand it. However, if you are a construction worker, landscaper, or anyone who does a lot of physical labor, your daily physical tasks will be extremely high and contribute more substantially to fatigue, right? So now you have the stuff that you do in the gym, but you also have the things that you're doing at work, all of which summating more and more fatigue throughout the day. We can also look at things like sleep deprivation. Obviously, you've probably heard that not getting enough sleep is bad for you, and that is absolutely correct, especially within this discussion. If you're not getting enough consistent sleep, we'll start to see performance tanking almost immediately, so that's no good. We know poor nutrition plays a big role, right? If you're not eating adequate calories, if you're not eating enough carbohydrates to match your workloads, if you're not eating enough protein to match your lean body mass, if you're dehydrated all the time, all these things can be really, really nasty in terms of fatigue. Also, if you're like chronically overusing stimulants or alcohol, guilty for both, that can be detrimental to your recovery as well. We also know that things like psychological stressors start to become problematic. Let's say your dog ate your mom, something crazy happened, some hillbilly like flips you off on the way to work, it really bothered you. Those things will start to cause you anxiety, stress, and that can start to accumulate and unfortunately start to have physical manifestations later on. So that sucks. We know that illness can play a role. If you get sick, your performance will be inhibited, and actually sometimes training itself can make you more susceptible to becoming sick. So that's kind of a vicious cycle, unfortunately. And then exposure to toxins, all sorts of things can apply here. You can think of things like poisons, but also things like alcohol, all other drugs, all of which will play a role in summating fatigue. Now, there's a lot of stuff there, right? A lot of different things can cause fatigue. The way that fatigue manifests can be slightly different depending on the circumstances. We know that there are central factors, meaning fatigue factors that can affect things like your heart, your lungs, your brain, spinal cord, your ability to actually make smooth coordinated movements. And we know it can be manifested more peripherally, meaning in the actual muscles and innervating tissues that you used, right? So an example of peripheral fatigue would be experienced in the quadriceps after doing a lot of heavy squats, or in the pec muscles after doing a lot of heavy bench, right? It's local to the trained muscles and the connecting tissues like the nerves, the connective tissues, all of which that you use to do that training session. However, confusion remains on this idea of central versus peripheral fatigue. We know that both of these things are present, but generally what we see more often than not is a lot of peripheral fatigue from training and only a lot of central fatigue under really, really gnarly bad conditions. So, again, this has led to a lot of confusion and a lot of, unfortunately, pseudoscience, witchcraft, voodoo doctors, naturopaths, all sorts of people making these outlandish new medical conditions as a result of the misdiagnosing fatigue, right? With very few exceptions. Fatigue is not a medical condition. It is a result of either bad planning, bad fatigue management, or bad lifestyle factors. There are exceptions to that, but they are very, very slim. And unfortunately, people have jumped on the bandwagon and seized the opportunity to sell false products and give misinformation, right? Which sucks because a lot of people want to feel like a special snowflake and say like, oh, well, I can't do all these things because I have space liver or llama kidney. That's bullshit, right? None of that makes any sense. It's these naturopaths. They're crazy. Why are they saying all these things? Well, unfortunately, they're kind of pandering this misinformation about fatigue. So we need to be clear about how some of these things work. Hence why we're studying fatigue management. All right. In order to understand the interrelation of fatigue and recovery, we have to understand an important concept, which is the fitness fatigue paradigm. This is something that you've probably heard myself and Mike and other people talking about, but it's good to reiterate and bring it back. So we know that training causes fitness. You go and do some hard training, you increase your fitness, whether that's muscle size, strength, power, all of those things. But at the same time, that same training that you did that's making you more fit also increases your fatigue. So now we have this kind of conundrum where you need to do a lot of training if you want to get better, but at the same time, a lot of training generates a lot of fatigue. We also know that the more fatigue that you generate and sort of accumulate, the more it has this nasty ability to start masking the fitness that you already have, or actually inhibiting you from expressing any fitness that you are trying to train or get better at. So kind of a nasty effect. We also know that most of our new fitness adaptations will only occur after recovery is occurring. Right? So we can't have adaptation without recovery. We have that big component there, right? We can have recovery without adaptation, but we can't have adaptation without recovery, aside from being completely new to training in general, right? But for most people who are not beginners, we see this relationship. So again, we need to have both. We want to have both that recovery period where we're getting back to baseline, but also that super compensatory period where we're going up above and beyond. And that can be depicted by Hans-Selye's general adaptation syndrome. Hopefully you've studied this in high school and college biology. If not, go back and look at it. It's important, right? Real quick, if you look at the slide, this is kind of a very over-dramatized example of what this looks like, but you can see that yellow line represents some baseline fitness, right? Whether it's muscle mass or strength or cardiovascular fitness, doesn't matter. Any of those things work fine. When you go and train, we start to experience some acute fatigue and our performance decreases a little bit. No big deal, totally expected. That time from the performance decrease up until it returns back to baseline is what we have defined as recovery, right? We say that's basically our return to baseline characteristic. And if we do a really good job with our recovery strategies, we can actually start to see that supercompensation, that rise above baseline and that new fitness adaptation, which is what we want. Awesome. Now, if you just keep training hard, and never take a break, we start to see that line come back down and you'll move into non-functional overreaching and overtraining syndrome. Conversely, if you stop training altogether, you'll start to experience adaptive decay or deconditioning and your fitness will go back down. So we need to have some kind of pulsatility where we have our baseline, we train hard, we encounter a stressor, and we see this kind of wave-like pattern over time where we don't see a linear increase in performance, we see kind of wave-like increases and decreases over time because of the overload principle and stimulus recovery adaptation. So very, very important. Now, in sports science and exercise science, we have a fancy term that we like to use called preparedness. And you might have heard me say this before, heard other people say this. Preparedness is kind of the net sum effect between the amount of fitness that you have and the amount of fatigue that you're carrying around. If you look at this graph, this is kind of an idealized mesocycle of training for something like hypertrophy or physique stuff. And here we can see training load is increasing over time, right? Which is what we would expect from a progressive overload. And what we can see at the blue line, fitness is going up, meaning we have continued to present an overload. That overload has gotten harder and harder over time and is very, very slowly raising our baseline fitness, which is awesome. What's the downside? Well, you see that red line is fatigue. And unfortunately for us, fatigue tends to rise very, very quickly and outpaces fitness very, very easily. Fitness comes slow, fatigue comes fast, right? What's the green line? Well, the green line is preparedness, the net kind of sum of those two things. And what do we notice? Because fatigue tends to outpace fitness, preparedness tends to go down. So what that means is your ability to express the fitness that you have tends to go down as fatigue is on the rise. Why is that important? Well, you might not even be able to express the fitness that you want in training because of fatigue, right? So if you are training to become more powerful, more explosive, or faster, you might be carrying around too much fatigue to even express the fitness needed to train for power and speed. See, kind of crazy when you think about it backwards like that, but it's very true. So we need to be aware of how much fitness we're carrying around relative to the amount of fatigue we're carrying around, and that is going to help us modulate our preparedness at any given time. So for the most part, what we have found, if we're looking at which things are probably the most influential for fatigue, the volume of training that you do, meaning the total work that you do, seems to be the most influential overall. So the more stuff you do in general, the more fatigue it will generate. Now within that volume, the greater the intensity or the average intensity, the greater the fatigue as well. So lower intensity stuff tends to not be as fatiguing. Higher intensity stuff tends to be more fatiguing and actually exponentially more fatiguing at the very, very top end. So volume's the big one, right? The more work you do, the more fatigue, even if it's not terribly hard. The harder you make it, the more fatigue you'll carry around as well. So the more fatigue you have, the less that you can actually express or train. So we have to keep in mind that idea of preparedness. You can't just infinitely keep getting more fitness and training harder and harder and harder. Fatigue will rear its ugly head sooner or later and start to hit the brakes on either your ability to continue training and expressing the things you want, or your ability to recover from training at all and continue training. So we have to keep tabs on those things. So this has led to kind of a bunch of different strategies, some which have merit, some maybe have less merit. The first one we can see is kind of the hyper-conservative approach, where people say, we must eliminate fatigue at all costs. You must maintain a high level of preparedness at all times. Not a bad thought. What's the downside? Well, if you're maintaining a high level of preparedness all the time, you are never able to actually present, or you're never actually presenting a sufficient overload. You are probably chronically under-training, because the only thing we need for recovery is to present a sufficient overload within the next time scale. So if you are chronically in a high state of preparedness, you are very likely chronically under-training what you could be doing and making more progress over time. On the other hand, we have people who like to pretend that fatigue isn't real, and there are some researchers who claim that the effects of fatigue are purely perceptive based. I'm not making this up. So a lot of people, prominent researchers in the field, say that there are no real physical effects of fatigue, it's all in your mind. That's probably not true either. We know that we can actually go and measure the physical effects of fatigue. I can put somebody on a force plate and say, boom, they are fatigued. Their performance, whether it's maximal or submaximal, has gone down. I can measure it. So, where's kind of the middle ground? What are we supposed to do with fatigue? Well, fatigue is necessary in order for us to do overload training. So we should not be avoiding fatigue at all costs. We just need to manage fatigue, right? We need to generate fatigue along the way and manage it as well. So if we are constantly trying to avoid fatigue, an overly conservative approach, you'll never get hurt, which is great, but you'll probably not make very good progress either. If you are under the impression that fatigue is all in your mind and you just need to grind it out, brother, you will very likely be succumb to overreaching, overtraining syndrome, or potentially injury at some point. So we need to train hard, deal with the fatigue in a productive way, and continue training hard over time. That is the goal of fatigue management. Fatigue management is not to avoid fatigue entirely, it's to manage it, as the name implies. So we're going to generate fatigue, and we're going to deal with it in the most appropriate way. We also want to be careful not to seek out strategies that, again, violate overload, so overly conservative, or strategies that actually can interfere with the recovery adaptive processes. And this sounds kind of weird, but later on in the subsequent videos, we'll talk about some strategies that actually make a little bit of a trade-off between recovery and adaptation, where they might enhance your recovery time at the expense of how much adaptation that you got from the training itself. Kind of weird. We'll get to that later. Don't worry about it for now. So, we have this like fitness fatigue conundrum. What do we do? How do I get what I want? I want to get more jacked, faster, stronger, better looking naked, all of those things. I know that I need to train hard, but I also know that fatigue prevents me from training hard. So where to start? Well, if you start Google searching, start looking up some basic stuff, you will find a bunch of nonsense, a bunch of complete crap, right? So how do I know what are some good things that I can start doing? How can I kind of mechanistically differentiate good things from bad things? Well, I have good news for you. I have already done the footwork for you. Not just me. My colleagues and I have done the footwork for you, and we have presented what we think are the best, most efficacious strategies for promoting recovery out there. Let's take a look. We have come up with this handy-dandy hierarchy, which you can see in our book, Recovering from Training. And we have rank ordered what we thought were the most efficacious strategies out there. And it's probably not going to look like what you might have thought. So we can see within the pyramid here, the base of the pyramid says training within your MRV, which is a construct we have created throughout the course of making the Recovering from Training book, unfortunately, that encompasses dose-response relationships of training. It's really interesting. When we were writing the recovery book, Recovering from Training, we had so much to say on this topic, training within your MRV. We ended up having about 80 or almost 100 pages at one point that was going to be included in the recovery book. And then Mike and I said, you know what, needs to be its own book. We have so much to say on this topic. It's so important. It's going to get its own book, right? And that's what led us to create the volume landmarks and the How Much Should I Train book. And what we can see is this concept of training within your volume landmarks makes up the base of our recovery pyramid, meaning it's the most important, has the biggest effect size of all the things that we can do. And I like to think of it as more of a prerequisite step. So a lot of people will say like, oh, okay, this is the most powerful thing. This is something you should have done ahead of time. This is something that you need to establish before you even move on to advanced recovery strategies. We'll get to that a little bit later. I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm so pumped. So what we can see here, training within your MRV, or training within your volume landmarks, as we like to say, is the most important factor. The next thing on our pyramid is a broad category of things we call passive recovery. Passive recovery includes things like sleeping, napping, relaxation, stress management, and planned rest. Essentially, recovery strategies where you are not investing energy into it. You're actually not doing anything, or at least not any physical training to any significant degree. And what we have found is that those strategies, aside from training within your volume landmarks, are incredibly powerful. And a lot of people pay a lot of lip service to them, but don't actually do them. Well, it turns out, in the context of recovering from training, they are some of the most powerful strategies out there. So if you're willing to ignore them, you might as well stop training altogether, because the rest of it will be a large waste of time for you. So very, very important that we get those things down. If we move up in our hierarchy, we can see nutrition and active recovery, both of which are really, really good. We could not mathematically differentiate the weight of having good nutrition strategies or good active recovery strategies. So we think they are equal in weight, but not as powerful as passive recovery strategies. So within nutrition, we're looking at things like eating an adequate amount of calories, making sure your macronutrients are on point, making sure your nutrient timing is on point, staying hydrated, things like that. Whereas in active recovery, we're looking at things that we do in training that actually reduces fatigue, right? So this is kind of a cool category because it allows us to keep training, but actually do stuff which allows us to drop fatigue throughout the training process. Pretty neat. So what are some things that we're going to see in active recovery? We're going to see things like deloads, periodization, light sessions, active rest, tapering, things along those lines. Very, very useful, not quite as powerful as passive recovery or training within the volume landmarks, but very, very noteworthy and should be included into your recovery strategies. At the top of the pyramid, we see our two least powerful strategies. Now, does that mean that they're bad? No, it just means that they're not as powerful as some of the other ones. They're worth discussing, they're worth your time, but not until you have done a good job with the previous strategies. So, what do we have? We have therapeutic strategies and supplemental strategies. Our therapeutic strategies are going to be, as the name implies, therapeutically based. So this will be using things like social support, relying on coaches, therapists, friends, family for support, and can include other things like compassionate touch, which sounds gross, and it is gross, and we'll get to that later. And on the other side, our supplemental strategies are strategies that we might use situationally. They're kind of the fun, sexy ones that most people want to know about, but they generally come sort of either at a trade-off, a little bit of a cost to us, or we might not want to use them all the time. It might be more of a situational, contextual use. Unfortunately for us, those fun, sexy ones that most people want to know about simply are not that powerful. Are they useful and potentially worth your time? Yes. However, they are not going to be as powerful as things like sleep, calories, and deloads, things like that. So what we're going to do in the subsequent videos is break all of these categories down, lay down a foundation of information about all of these things, and give you some practical insight on how to incorporate them into your training. Guys, I hope you're pumped. This is going to be a really great series. Next time we see each other, we're going to talk about training within the volume landmarks. I'm James Hoffman. I'll see you soon.